Tartaria Mystery, Uncovering a Lost Civilization. What if I told you that less than 200 years ago, there existed a vast empire that stretched across much of Asia and Eastern Europe? An empire so powerful, so advanced, that its buildings still stand today in cities around the world. An empire that appears on maps from the 1700s and 1800s, documented by cartographers and historians. And yet, an empire that has been almost completely erased from our modern history books. This is the story of Tartaria, or more accurately, this is the mystery of Tartaria, a civilization that existed on paper, in maps, in documents, and possibly in reality. But somewhere along the way, its story was lost, hidden, or deliberately obscured. Today, we're going to explore one of the most fascinating alternative history theories of our time. We'll examine the evidence, look at the maps, study the architecture, and ask questions that historians have been reluctant to answer. Whether Tartaria was a real empire with advanced technology, a collection of independent regions grouped under one name, or something else entirely, one thing is certain: the official narrative doesn't tell the whole story. So settle in, open your mind, and prepare to question everything you thought you knew about the 19th century. This is the mystery of Tartari. Let's start with something undeniable: the maps. If you go to any major library, any serious cartographic archive, any collection of historical atlases, you will find maps from the 1700s and 1800s that clearly label a massive region as Tartaria or Tartary. These aren't obscure maps made by fringe cartographers. We're talking about official maps created by the leading geographers of their time, maps published by prestigious institutions, maps used for navigation, trade, and diplomacy. On these maps, Tartaria isn't small, it's enormous. Depending on the map and the era, it stretches from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, from Siberia down to parts of Central Asia. Some maps even show different regions: independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Muscovite Tartary, Tibetan Tartary. This suggests not just a single unified empire, but a collection of related territories, or perhaps a cultural sphere of influence. The Encyclopedia Britannica from 1771 includes detailed entries about Tartary. It describes the geography, the people, the climate. It's not treating this as mythology or legend, it's documenting it as a real place with real inhabitants. So here's the first question. If Tartaria was important enough to be featured prominently on maps for over a century, important enough to be included in encyclopedias and geographical texts, why is it barely mentioned in modern history books? Why don't we learn about it in school? The standard historical explanation is that Tartary was simply a catch-all term that European cartographers used to describe the vast, little-known regions of Central and Northern Asia. According to this view, it wasn't a unified empire or even a specific civilization. It was just a label for territories that Europeans didn't fully understand. But that explanation raises more questions than it answers. If it was just a vague term for unknown lands, why did cartographers continue using it for so long? Why did they divide it into specific regions with distinct names? Why did encyclopedias describe its people, culture, and geography in such detail? And here's something even more interesting. The name Tartaria or Tartary appears to derive from Tatar, referring to various Turkic and Mongolic peoples who lived in these regions. The Mongol Empire of Genghis Khan and his descendants did indeed control much of this territory in the 13th and 14th centuries. So perhaps Tartaria was the name that stuck for these regions even after the Mongol Empire fragmented. But some researchers have proposed something far more intriguing. They suggest that Tartaria wasn't just a leftover name from the Mongol era. They propose that a distinct Tartarian civilization existed well into the 1800s with its own advanced culture, architecture, and technology, and that this civilization was deliberately erased from history following a series of catastrophic events and geopolitical reorganizations in the 19th century. Now, before you dismiss this as pure conspiracy theory, let's look at the evidence. Let's examine what can be verified and what remains mysterious. Because the truth, as always, is complex and fascinating. One of the most compelling aspects of the Tartaria theory involves architecture. And this is where things get really interesting, because we're not talking about buildings that have disappeared. We're talking about buildings that still exist today all around the world. Walk through almost any major city that was established or expanded in the 1800s, and you'll notice something remarkable. The architecture is stunning. Elaborate facades, intricate details, massive scale, sophisticated engineering, buildings constructed with such precision and artistry that modern architects struggle to explain how they were built with the technology supposedly available at the time. We're talking about courthouses, train stations, government buildings, exhibition halls, churches, and libraries. Structures featuring soaring domes, ornate columns, detailed stonework, and architectural elements that seem almost too advanced for their era. The official story is that these buildings were constructed during the height of the Industrial Revolution by various nations using conventional construction methods of the time. But Tartaria researchers ask some uncomfortable questions. How did cities across the world, often separated by thousands of miles, develop such similar architectural styles during the same period? How were such massive, elaborate structures built so quickly, often in newly settled areas with limited populations and resources? Take the World's Fairs and international exhibitions of the late 1800s and early 1900s. These events featured enormous temporary structures that were supposedly built in just months, used for a few weeks or months, and then demolished. The buildings were described as temporary plaster and wood frame constructions, yet photographs show massive, elaborate structures that look permanent and substantial. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, for example, featured hundreds of ornate buildings spread across more than 600 acres. The official story says these were temporary structures built specifically for the fair. But some researchers look at the photographs and ask, do these really look temporary? Could they have been built that quickly? Or were they perhaps existing structures that were repurposed for the exhibition? Now, I want to be clear here. The mainstream historical record does document the construction of these fair buildings. There are photographs, construction records, and newspaper accounts from the time. So we're not suggesting these buildings simply appeared out of nowhere. But the Tartaria theory proposes something more nuanced, that many of the grand structures built in the 1800s weren't newly constructed at all. Instead, they were existing buildings from a previous civilization that were being restored, repurposed, or claimed by the emerging nation-states of the era. This leads us to one of the most intriguing pieces of architectural evidence, the phenomenon of buried first floors. In cities all over the world, particularly in Europe and North America, there are buildings where the current ground level is significantly higher than it was when the building was constructed. What we now consider the first floor was originally the second floor. The true first floor, with its windows and doorways, is now underground. The conventional explanation is straightforward. Over time, cities raised their street levels due to flooding concerns, infrastructure improvements, or the gradual accumulation of debris and construction materials. And yes, this did happen in many cities. Seattle, for example, deliberately raised its street level after a fire in 1889, creating the famous Seattle Underground. But Tartaria researchers point out that this phenomenon is extraordinarily widespread, not just in one or two cities, but in dozens of major cities across multiple continents. And they ask, were all of these cities prone to flooding? Did they all independently decide to raise their street levels at roughly the same time in history? Or is there another explanation? Some propose that a catastrophic event in the 1800s, possibly a massive mud flood or series of floods, buried the lower levels of existing structures, and that the survivors emerging from this catastrophe simply rebuilt on top of the buried levels, creating new ground floors and attributing the architecture to their own recent construction. Now, is there geological evidence for a global mud flood in the 1800s? Not really, at least not in the mainstream scientific literature. But there is evidence of significant climate anomalies during this period. The year without a summer in 1816, caused by the volcanic eruption of Mount Tambora, led to widespread crop failures and bizarre weather patterns. There were other volcanic eruptions throughout the century. There were earthquakes, tsunamis, and localized floods. Could a series of natural disasters have been more catastrophic than official records indicate? Could they have contributed to the fall of a civilization that was then written out of history by the powers that replaced it? Let's consider another architectural mystery: the prevalence of advanced features in supposedly primitive or recently settled areas. When European settlers moved westward across North America in the 1800s, they supposedly built cities from scratch in wilderness areas. Yet within just years or decades, these frontier towns had elaborate brick and stone buildings, sophisticated water and sewer systems, electric street lighting, and ornate architecture that rivaled European cities. The official explanation credits rapid industrialization, the railroad system, and the determination of settlers. And certainly, these factors played a role. But some researchers wonder, were settlers always building on empty land, or were they sometimes moving into areas where infrastructure and buildings already existed, remnants of a previous civilization that had occupied these lands? There are historical accounts of settlers finding strange ruins, unusual earthworks, and unexplained structures in areas that were supposed to be pristine wilderness. Many of these accounts were dismissed or attributed to Native American peoples, though the architecture often bore no resemblance to known indigenous building styles. The Tartaria theory suggests that much of North America, particularly in the northern regions, may have been part of the Tartarian sphere of influence, and that when this civilization fell, its structures remained to be claimed and repurposed by new arrivals who wrote their own history. If Tartaria was real, if it was as vast and advanced as some researchers claim, then what happened to it? How does an entire civilization disappear from history? This is where the Tartaria theory ventures into its most controversial territory: the concept of the Great Reset, or the Mud Flood, that supposedly occurred in the early to mid-1800s. According to this hypothesis, a catastrophic event or series of events in the 19th century led to the collapse of Tartarian civilization. The exact nature of this catastrophe varies depending on which researcher you ask. Some propose massive floods, others suggest electromagnetic disturbances or atmospheric phenomena. Some even speculate about advanced weaponry or technological disasters. What most agree on is that whatever happened, it was significant enough to destroy or severely damage a global civilization, bury cities under layers of mud and debris, and create an opportunity for new powers to emerge and rewrite history. Let's examine what we know about the 1800s from mainstream history. It was a century of enormous change. The Industrial Revolution transformed economies and societies. Colonial empires expanded across the globe. Political revolutions overthrew old monarchies. The maps of the world were redrawn multiple times. It was also a century of significant natural disasters and climate anomalies. Beyond the year without a summer, in 1816, there were major volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and floods throughout the century. The Carrington event of 1859 was the most powerful geomagnetic storm on record, causing widespread disruption to telegraph systems and creating auroras visible near the equator. In the 1870s and 1880s, there were reports of strange atmospheric phenomena, unusual weather patterns, and devastating floods in various parts of the world. Could these have been more catastrophic than official records indicate? Here's something interesting. The late 1800s saw an explosion of institutional record-keeping and historical documentation. National archives were established, libraries were organized, official histories were written. It was almost as if there was a coordinated effort to create an authoritative historical narrative. Now, you could argue that this was simply the natural result of industrialization and modernization. As societies became more complex and literate, they naturally developed better systems for preserving information. And that's a perfectly reasonable explanation. But Tartaria researchers see something more sinister, a deliberate effort to control the historical narrative, to erase evidence of what came before, and to establish new power structures that claimed legitimacy by controlling the past. They point to photographs from the late 1800s showing cities covered in ash or mud, buildings half buried, people digging out from disasters. They note the prevalence of orphan trains in America during this period, with thousands of children reportedly orphaned and sent west to new families. They observe the rapid construction of insane asylums and the institutionalization of people who might have been survivors with memories of a different world. They ask uncomfortable questions. Why were so many old buildings demolished in the early 1900s? Why were so many historical records lost in convenient fires? Why did so many indigenous peoples around the world have legends of a great flood or catastrophe that doesn't appear in official histories? Let me be clear, much of this is speculative. The evidence is circumstantial. The connections are sometimes tenuous, but that doesn't mean the questions aren't worth asking. Consider the phenomenon of founded dates for cities. Many cities around the world, particularly North America, have official founding dates in the 1800s. But when you look at photographs from just years after these founding dates, you see fully developed cities with elaborate architecture, infrastructure, and established populations. How did such development happen so quickly? The official answer involves rapid industrialization, railroad access, and waves of immigration. And again, these factors certainly contributed. But some researchers wonder if these founding dates actually mark not the creation of new cities, but the formal establishment of new governmental structures in already existing settlements. There's also the curious case of technology. The late 1800s saw an explosion of patents and inventions. Electricity, radio, advanced metallurgy, sophisticated machinery. Where did all this knowledge come from? Was it purely the result of scientific advancement, or could some of it have been recovered or reverse engineered from a previous civilization? Nikola Tesla, one of the most brilliant inventors of the era, claimed that his ideas came to him fully formed, as if he was remembering or accessing information rather than inventing from scratch. He spoke of wireless energy transmission, global communication systems, and technologies that seemed impossibly advanced for his time. Where did his knowledge come from? Some Tartaria researchers proposed that Tesla and other inventors of the era were rediscovering or adapting technologies that had existed before, technologies from the Tartarian civilization that had been lost in the catastrophe. Now, I'm not saying this is definitely true. I'm saying it's an interesting question. And the fact that mainstream historians often refuse to even engage with these questions is itself curious. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Tartaria theory involves energy and technology, specifically the possibility that Tartarian civilization possessed advanced methods of generating and distributing electrical energy. Look closely at photographs of buildings from the 1800s and early 1900s. Many feature elaborate spires, domes, and towers topped with ornate metal finials. The official explanation is that these are purely decorative or architectural elements, but some researchers see something else. Antennas. Energy collectors, components of a wireless power distribution system. This ties directly to Tesla's work on wireless energy transmission. Tesla believed that electricity could be transmitted through the air and the earth without wires, making it freely available to everyone. He built experimental towers to demonstrate this concept, but his funding was cut off, his research was suppressed, and his vision of free wireless energy was never realized. Or was it? Tartaria researchers proposed that Tesla wasn't inventing a new system. He was trying to rebuild an old one. They suggest that the spires and domes on old buildings were part of an atmospheric energy collection system that provided power to Tartarian civilization, and that this system was deliberately dismantled or destroyed when that civilization fell. There's an intriguing piece of evidence here. Many old buildings, particularly from the 1800s, have no apparent chimneys or heating systems. How were they heated? Some buildings do have small ventilation shafts, but often not enough to support coal or wood heating systems that would have been necessary for such large structures. The Tartaria theory proposes that these buildings were heated and powered by the wireless energy system, which is why they didn't need extensive heating infrastructure. Then there are the mysterious star forts found around the world. These are fortifications with distinctive star-shaped geometric patterns, often with very specific mathematical proportions. Hundreds of these structures exist on every continent. The official explanation is that they were military fortifications designed to withstand cannon fire. But some researchers note peculiarities. Many star forts are located in areas with no apparent strategic military value. Some are found in remote locations far from historical battle sites. Their mathematical precision and geometric consistency across cultures and continents suggest a shared design principle rather than independent military innovation. Could star forts have been part of an energy grid? Their geometric shapes, their strategic positioning, their construction materials, all could have served functions beyond simple military defense. Some researchers even propose that they were power stations or nodes in the wireless energy network. And then there are the World's Fairs themselves. These massive exhibitions showcased the latest technology and innovations, but they also featured something curious: enormous electrical displays and illuminations powered by newly installed generators and power systems. The official story is that these were demonstrations of emerging electrical technology. But Tartaria researchers ask, what if these fairs were actually celebrations of rediscovered technology? What if the electrical systems weren't new inventions, but restorations of old capabilities? The timing is interesting. The Great World's Fairs coincide with the period when Tartaria disappears from maps, and when new electrical technologies suddenly emerge. Consider also the architecture of old electrical substations and power plants from the early 1900s. These buildings are often elaborately designed, far more ornate than necessary for their industrial function. They feature the same architectural style as older public buildings, with columns, arches, and decorative elements. Why would utility buildings be constructed with such aesthetic attention? Some propose that these weren't newly built power stations, but repurposed Tartarian energy facilities, their original function partially restored, but now controlled by new corporate and governmental entities rather than being freely available. Now, I want to emphasize, there's no definitive proof of a wireless energy grid in the 1800s. Tesla's theories remain largely unproven. But the questions persist. Why did Tesla believe so strongly in wireless energy? Where did his confidence come from? And why was his work so thoroughly suppressed? If Tartaria was real, if it was erased from official history, surely there would be some trace of it in cultural memory and folklore, in the stories people tell about their past. And interestingly, there is. Around the world, indigenous peoples and local communities have legends and oral histories that don't quite match the official narrative. Stories of great civilizations that came before, tales of catastrophic floods that reshaped the world, memories of advanced peoples who built magnificent structures and then vanished. Native American traditions speak of various peoples who inhabited North America before them, some with advanced knowledge and capabilities. The Hopi speak of previous worlds that were destroyed by catastrophes. The Lakota have legends of a great flood. Cultures across the Americas reference star people or sky people who brought knowledge and technology. In Asia, there are similar stories, legends of vast empires that rose and fell. tales of advanced civilizations lost to disaster. The historical records of China, India, and other Asian cultures contain references to foreign peoples and mysterious kingdoms that don't appear in Western histories. Even in Europe, there are legends of lost civilizations, of great floods, of times when the world was different. The biblical flood story is just one example. Celtic, Norse, and Slavic traditions all contain elements of catastrophic change and lost wisdom. Could these legends be cultural memories of Tartaria? Could they be fragments of history that survived as folklore when official records were destroyed or rewritten? There's also linguistic evidence to consider. Many languages contain words and place names that don't seem to originate from known sources. Etymology becomes murky when tracing certain terms back beyond the 1800s. Could some of these linguistic mysteries point to a Tartarian origin? The word Tartar itself is interesting. It appears in European languages with various connotations, some referring to the peoples of Central Asia, others carrying meanings of wildness or barbarism. This negative connotation might itself be evidence of a propaganda campaign. The winners write history, and they often demonize those they've conquered or replaced. There's a historical pattern here that's worth noting. Throughout history, conquering civilizations have typically erased or demonized the cultures they replaced. The Romans did it to the Carthaginians. The Spanish did it to the Aztecs and Incas. Colonial powers did it to indigenous peoples worldwide. The process usually involves several steps. First, military conquest. Then, destruction or appropriation of physical structures and artifacts. Next, suppression of the conquered people's language and culture. Finally, rewriting of history to justify the conquest and establish the legitimacy of the new rulers. If Tartaria did exist and was conquered or fell to catastrophe, we would expect to see exactly this pattern: physical structures claimed or demolished, cultural elements suppressed, history rewritten, and the people themselves either absorbed into new populations or marginalized and demonized. And to some extent, this is what we see with the treatment of Turkic and Mongolic peoples in European historical accounts. They're often portrayed as barbaric hordes, uncivilized invaders, destructive forces. But primary sources from within these cultures paint a very different picture of sophisticated societies with rich cultural traditions, advanced administrative systems, and remarkable achievements. The Mongol Empire, for example, is often reduced in Western education to Genghis Khan's conquests, but at its height it was one of the most advanced civilizations on Earth, with sophisticated postal systems, religious tolerance, meritocratic governance, and remarkable feats of engineering and organization. Could what we call the Mongol Empire have actually been Tartaria? Could the historical account of fragmented Mongol successor states be a simplified version of a more complex reality in which Tartarian civilization continued and evolved for centuries after Genghis Khan? There's also the matter of suppressed histories and forbidden archaeology. Throughout the 1800s and early 1900s, there were numerous archaeological discoveries that didn't fit the emerging historical narrative. Giant skeletons, unusual artifacts, structures that seemed too advanced for their supposed age. Many of these discoveries were dismissed. Artifacts disappeared into museum storage, and sites were often destroyed during development projects. Was this simply because these discoveries were fraudulent or misidentified? Or was there a more deliberate effort to suppress evidence that contradicted official history? So where does this leave us? Is Tartaria real? Was there a great reset? Did an advanced civilization exist in the 1800s and get erased from history? The honest answer is, we don't know for certain, and that uncertainty is actually important to embrace, because the value of the Tartaria theory isn't necessarily whether it's literally true in every detail. The value is in the questions it raises and the way it encourages us to critically examine accepted narratives. Here's what we can say with confidence: Tartaria as a name and geographical designation absolutely appears on historical maps and documents. This is not disputed. The disagreement is about what that name represented. The mainstream view is that it was simply a European label for poorly understood Asian territories. The alternative view is that it represented a real civilization with its own identity and achievements. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Tartaria probably wasn't a monolithic empire with a single government ruling from the Pacific to the Caspian Sea, but it may have been a cultural sphere, a collection of related peoples and civilizations with shared characteristics, trade networks, and possibly shared technologies. The architecture questions are legitimate and fascinating. The similarity of building styles across vast distances in the 1800s is remarkable. The speed of construction often does seem improbable given the technology and populations supposedly available. The buried first floors are a real phenomenon that deserves more investigation. But we should be cautious about jumping to conclusions. Humans are capable of remarkable achievements. The Industrial Revolution did enable rapid construction. Architecture does spread through cultural exchange. And yes, many cities did deliberately raise their street levels for legitimate reasons. The catastrophe theories are the most speculative aspect of Tartaria research. While the 1800s did see significant natural disasters and climate anomalies, there's no clear evidence of a single global catastrophe that destroyed a civilization. However, a series of disasters combined with geopolitical upheaval could have had devastating effects that are understated in official histories. The energy theories are intriguing but lack substantial evidence. Tesla's work on wireless energy was real and remains fascinating. The architectural features some identify as antennas could have had that function, but we need more than speculation to prove such claims. So what should we take away from the Tartaria mystery? First, that history is more complex and uncertain than we often acknowledge. The neat narratives we learn in school are simplifications of messy, complicated realities. There are gaps in the historical record. There are questions without clear answers, and that's okay. That's actually how history should be, an ongoing investigation, not a closed case. Second, that questioning official narratives is healthy and important. Not questioning in a cynical, paranoid way that rejects all expertise and evidence, but questioning in a curious, open-minded way that recognizes that those in power do sometimes shape history to serve their interests. Third, that physical evidence matters. The buildings exist, the maps exist, the photographs exist. These are real artifacts that deserve serious study, regardless of whether they support conventional or alternative historical theories. Fourth, that we should be open to the possibility that our ancestors were more advanced than we give them credit for. The assumption that human capability has always increased linearly over time may be false. Civilizations rise and fall. Knowledge can be lost and rediscovered. Progress isn't always steady or permanent. And finally, that mystery itself has value. We live in an age that claims to have everything figured out, everything explained, everything documented. But the Tartaria mystery reminds us that there are still unknowns, still discoveries to be made, still questions to explore. Whether Tartaria was an empire, a geographical designation, or something in between, it represents something important. The recognition that our understanding of the past is incomplete, that there are stories yet to be told, evidence yet to be examined, truths yet to be uncovered. So I encourage you to do your own research. Look at the maps, study the architecture in your own city, read the old encyclopedias, examine the photographs, ask the uncomfortable questions, but also be rigorous in evaluating evidence. Don't accept claims just because they're alternative. Demand proof, seek multiple sources, think critically. The truth about Tartaria, whatever it may be, will emerge through careful investigation, open dialogue, and honest scholarship, not through dogmatic acceptance of any single narrative, mainstream or alternative. History is not a fixed thing written in stone. It's a living conversation between past and present, constantly being revised as new evidence emerges and new perspectives develop. The Tartaria theory, whatever its ultimate validity, has reopened questions that many thought were settled. And in doing so, it's reminded us that the past still has secrets to reveal. Keep questioning, keep investigating, keep your mind open but your standards high, because the greatest discoveries often come not from accepting what we're told, but from asking what we haven't been told. This has been the Mystery of Tartaria. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history, mystery, and possibility. Until next time, keep exploring, keep wondering, and keep seeking the truth wherever it may lead.